Folks, this is the Eric Metaxas Show. As you know, I love talking about science with people who know more about science than I do. That's a lot of people. We have Dr. Stephen Meyer with us today, who has a new book out called The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen Meyer, welcome back.
It's great to be with you, as always, Eric.
Listen, the book, I've known about this book for a long time. I read an early version of it. Just the title gets me excited. Tell people who know nothing about this. I mean, first of all, I will simply say that you've written many books and you're with the Discovery Institute up in Seattle. You're one of the proponents of the intelligent design movement. This book, The Return of the Hypothesis, has been on your heart, so to speak, for a long time. So tell us the nutshell version of what is this book and why you wrote this book now. And it's brand new, it's just out.
Right. Well, the book tells a big story. It tells the story, first, of the rise of modern science in a Judeo-Christian milieu in Western Europe between, say, 1300 and 1750, especially in the period of time about 1500 to 1750 that scientists call, or that historians of science call, the scientific revolution. We've heard from our new atheist friends on the other side of the argument that science and religion have always been at war, especially science and Christianity. But in fact, it was Christianity and the Judeo-Christian assumptions that came out of, in part, the Hebrew Bible and in part out of late medieval Catholic theology and Reformed theology that gave rise to modern science. Ideas like the
Well, no, hang on. I just want to say that this is such a headline. This is such a headline. It should be the headline of what you and I are talking about right now. I mean, for this video we're making and for the radio program, the headline should be Christian faith gave us science, period. Christian faith gave us science. I know this, and I'm putting it in my book, which is coming out in the fall, but I know it in part because of you and because of the book that you have coming out right now called The Return of the God Hypothesis. I also got it from Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton, who wrote about it 20 years ago. But it is so open and shut, Stephen. This is what blows my mind. There is no question that you documented in your book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. There's no question that science came out directly of Christian faith. There's no doubt about it. The only question is, why and how, and that's what you talk about in the book. So let's get into that a little bit. Tell us why the scientific world as we know it, the scientific revolution, came out of the Christian faith. Tell us
absolutely. And thanks for not letting me bury the lead here. I mean, it really is a big story, and historians of science know this story and tell it. It's very well documented by leading historians of science. And you can tell by the metaphors that the early scientists used as they describe nature. They talk about nature as a book. That there was, just as there's a book of scripture, there's a book of nature, and God reveals himself in both books. They talked about nature as a great mechanism, a clock that had been designed by the great artificer who had put all the mechanisms in place to give us an orderly world. They talked about the laws of nature, understanding laws. The idea of the laws of nature was, as one historian of science puts it, a juridical metaphor of theological origin. There are laws in nature because there is a divine lawgiver. And they had also a crucial watchword, and that was intelligibility. The early scientists thought that we could understand nature, understand its rationality, its order, its design, because it had been made by a rational creator who had in turn made us and endowed us with the same rationality that he had built into the universe so that we could understand the universe. There was a principle of correlation there.
Okay, but before you go on, let me just say that what you're saying about the Christian God and about the biblical God, that is not normal. In other words, it's unique to the Bible. And when you look at other religions, when you look at even the ancient Greeks, when you look at the Chinese, when you look at the Muslim world, they all had advanced civilizations, but none of them had the theology that we get in Western Christendom in the 14th century, in the 15th century, and so on. They didn't have that theology, so they didn't give the world science as we know it. Christendom did.
Excellent, very well put. There's a great Cambridge historian, Herbert Butterfield, who said that to get science going, there needed to be not just the material necessities of science. They existed in many advanced cultures, and there were many advanced and sophisticated cultures, the Romans, the Chinese, the Islamic world, but there needed to be a transposition of thinking. And that, he said, came with this Judeo-Christian worldview of seeing nature not only as orderly, but as being endowed with an order that was impressed on it by a creator. The Greeks believed in an orderly world, but they thought that the order was intrinsic. There was a kind of logical necessity to the order. So they believed in something called the logos. And they thought because nature had to be logical, that they could understand it doing armchair philosophy, kind of sitting back and just reasoning, how should things be? And they came up with ideas like, well, all the orbits must be circular because the circle is the most perfect motion. Robert Boyle said, it's not the job of the natural philosopher, the scientist, to think about what God must have done, but rather to go and look and see what he did do. And so the idea that nature has a contingent order, an order that was impressed upon it by its creator, it might be with gravitation, it might be an inverse square law, an inverse cube law, it might not be an inverse law at all. You have to go look and see what type of order was impressed upon nature. And so historians of science credit Christianity and really the Judeo-Christian tradition, going back to the Hebrew Bible as well, as the source of that idea that nature was created with an order, but an order that was determined by God, not by what seemed most logical to us.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, God is logical, but his logic is way beyond, for example, Aristotle, right? I mean, Aristotle was brilliant. So he says, okay, it's obvious an orderly God or an orderly universe would give us planets that travel in perfect circles, and every planet and every sun or whatever it is, they have to be perfect spheres. And yet reality is different from that, but it's not illogical. It's not like a sloppy God, right? It's just that God's order is far higher than the order of Aristotle, and people kind of got stuck in Aristotle.
Well, and what I used to say to my students was there are many ways to skin a cat. I used to use the illustration, not for skinning cats, but of painters with lots of different paintbrushes. And you use a different paintbrush for different applications. So we could infer, we could, based on Aristotle's logic, think, well, we're going to need something like a paintbrush. We're going to need something like gravity to hold the universe together. But gravity could come in lots of different forms. It could be very strong, very weak. It could have different mathematical expressions. And so what the early scientists in the period of the scientific revolution realized is that they couldn't just deduce the form of gravity or any other natural phenomena. They had to go carefully look to see what type of order was there, what type of paintbrush was actually used to make the masterpiece of creation, if you will.
Well, I find it all funny and delightful because this is the precise opposite of what we've been hearing in our lifetimes. In our lifetimes, as you said earlier, we've been hearing that somehow science and faith are enemies. And what we're discovering is literally the opposite. Faith in the Bible led to science as we know it. This is a blockbuster headline. You talk about it in your book. I mentioned Charles Thaxton and Nancy Pearcey. They talked about it in their book,
Soul of Science.
Soul of Science, about 21, 22 years ago.
Yep.
This is huge stuff. And we live in a world where almost no one knows this, which is why I get so excited about your book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. I mean, this is monumental. This is paradigm shifting.
And the title of the book is meant to invite a story. And the story is the rise of modern science in a theistic context. But then also, if the God hypothesis is returning, that implies that that perspective was lost. And indeed it was during the late 19th century, early 20th century. It became kind of the default way of thinking, to think that nature was eternal and self-existent. In other words, a naturalistic or materialistic worldview replaced the theistic worldview with figures like Darwin, Marx, Freud, Huxley, and many others in the late 19th century. That became the default way of thinking about nature and about science during much of the 20th century. But the argument of the book is that that initial theistic perspective is now beginning to come back, not in spite of, but because of scientific discoveries, especially about biological and cosmological origins.
Okay, we're going to come back. We're going to keep talking to Stephen Meyer until he runs out of the room. So we're going to talk as long as we can. Do not go away, folks. The Return of the God Hypothesis is the book. Folks, I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Meyer. The new book, the old book is Signature in the Cell. There are many wonderful books, but the new one is called Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, in the book, you make a number of kind of huge statements that you back them up magnificently. So there's no doubt this is not some theory. It's just clear. But in a lot of ways, it's an issue of, how do I put it? It's an issue of getting the word out. In other words, everything you write about in the book has been true for a long time. It's not that there are any really particularly new things. It's just that the conversation is shifting. And why is the conversation shifting? Why are we talking about this now? Whereas, 50 years ago, everybody acted as though faith is the enemy of science.
Well, I talk about three big discoveries that have occurred in the last century. The first is the discovery that, as best we can tell, the universe had a beginning. The second is that the universe has been finely tuned for life from the beginning. And then thirdly, that there is the discovery of the digital code, the information and information processing systems that are at the foundation of life and even the very simplest living cells, that there have been big bursts of information into our biosphere. Now, all of these discoveries have been known for some time, 100 years or so in cosmology, 50 years or so in physics, and the biological things have been known since the molecular biological revolution. But more and more scientists are beginning to appreciate the inability to explain those discoveries on the basis of strictly materialistic hypotheses. Attempts to circumvent the Big Bang theory with ideas like the steady state or the oscillating universe have one by one progressively fallen to the wayside. Attempts to explain the fine tuning by something called the multiverse is, I think, increasingly seen as implausible by many scientists and many physicists. And the depths of our understanding of the complexity, the informational complexity present in living organisms, we just continue to discover more and more about that. So
okay, so we got three things here. I want to cover these each in more depth. First, we talk about the Big Bang. Then we talk about the fine-tuned universe, and then we talk about, I guess, abiogenesis and the complexity of cells and that kind of thing. So let's go to the Big Bang first. Basically, we've known since the beginning of the 20th century, the universe is expanding, and Father Lemaitre was the first one to say it all came out of a primeval atom. But it wasn't really for sure until 1964, the Penzias-Wilson discovery of the background radiation. That's kind of when we knew that this happened. It's not just a theory anymore, but it still took a long time for the knowledge that the universe had a beginning to kind of work its way into the culture and into these conversations. A lot of people were still sticking with some of the ideas of a steady state.
There were still some significant anomalies that needed to be explained by the Big Bang Theory into the early 90s. There's something called the COBE, a cosmic background explorer. They were able to resolve some of those anomalies by some of the observations they made of the cosmic background radiation. But the story of the discovery of the beginning is just an absolutely fascinating one, because it starts with, as you mentioned, the discovery in the 1920s that the light coming from distant galaxies is being stretched out, and therefore it looks redder than it should otherwise look, an indication of longer stretched out wavelengths of light.
That was Hubble.
That was Hubble, and even earlier, a lesser-known astronomer named Vesto Slipher, and I tell the story of these guys in the book. But in addition to that evidence from observational astronomy of galaxies receding and therefore the universe expanding, Einstein's great theory of general relativity implied a dynamic expanding universe. Einstein attempted initially to gerrymander his equations to try to avoid that conclusion, but then later, when confronted with the evidence of the redshift and the galactic expansion, acknowledged that his attempt to avoid the conclusion of the beginning was, quote, the greatest blunder of my scientific career.
And I love the fact that he said it in German, so it's translated blunder.
Blunder.
But it's also been translated stupidity, the greatest stupidity of my career. So, okay, around 1929, probably in Pasadena, I think he makes this announcement that, okay, I was wrong. But it still takes decades and decades for this to work its way through. You've got people like Fred Hoyle and others stuck on the idea that it can't be that the universe has a beginning. It's too preposterous. It's too odious. It's too annoying.
And it's interesting how overtly philosophical the opposition to the idea of a beginning was. Hoyle acknowledged that it came right out of his scientific materialism and atheism.
I mean, so did Einstein in a way. I mean, Einstein didn't like it because it implied this kind of Christian idea of the beginning. I mean, of course, it's also Jewish, but they all felt as though the idea of the Big Bang was unscientific.
Because there was, as one later physicist, Robert Dicke, put it, an infinite universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. But conversely, if the universe has a finite beginning, if it begins a finite time ago, then you can't explain the origin of the universe by any prior matter, because there was no matter prior to the beginning of matter. And therefore, you need some sort of explanation that involves something immaterial and which transcends matter, space, time, and energy. And that sounded to an awful lot of physicists like God. Now, to bring it up to, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say what I think that really bothered them, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but the idea that you could go back to a point in time, 13.8 billion years ago, where the entire universe comes out of a point, of an infinitely dense, infinitely hot point. I mean, basically that's the end of science. In other words, you go back and the laws of physics and everything breaks down. There's a moment at which the laws of physics and everything emerges, and that just bothered them because they wanted to think, no, the laws of physics and all of this stuff has always been here. We don't like to think that there's a time where science can't go back to or before. I guess
this was the importance of Stephen Hawking's initial work in the 1960s. As a PhD student, he was working on black hole physics, and black holes are places where the matter is so densely concentrated that it curves space so tightly, according to Einstein's theory of gravity, that not even light can get out. And Hawking began to think about, well, what happens if we back extrapolated? The universe is expanding now, but if you go backwards in time, the matter would be getting more and more densely concentrated, causing space to curve more and more tightly. And at some point, you'd reach a limiting case where the curvature of space would go to an infinite, corresponding to zero spatial volume. And at that point, called the singularity, as you say, the laws of physics utterly break down. And as the physicist Paul Davies has explained, beyond that point, beyond that extremity, as he puts it, no physical reasoning is possible. You can't explain the origin of the universe from physics because there's no physics before that time to do the explaining.
So you can imagine that to somebody who has a materialistic worldview, to go back to a point where there is no matter and therefore no science, it's confounding, and so it really bothered them. So you're putting this, the Big Bang is one of the three things that we're dealing with right now that points everybody to God, whether you like it or not. Science has led us to this hypothesis that there is a God, and the Big Bang is exhibit number one, I guess.
Absolutely. And also the attempts to circumvent that implication of a beginning that have come about. Hawking himself didn't like the implications of his own so-called singularity theorem. And from the 1980s on, he was attempting to explain the origin of the universe, not by reference to Einstein's theory of gravitation, which led to that singularity, but he was trying to invoke quantum physics ideas to try to explain the origin of the universe in a different way that either circumvented the beginning or could explain the universe as a consequence of the mathematical laws of quantum mechanics. And that led to a strange paradox, which itself had theistic implications, because in that depiction of the origin of the universe of matter, space, time, and energy literally comes out of a mathematical equation, something called the universal wave function. And yet, both Hawking and another Russian physicist who was developing some of these same ideas noticed that was oddly philosophical, because math, as Valenkin, as the Russian physicist pointed out, math is something that exists in minds. And he says, before there is matter, space, time, and energy, what tablet could these mathematical laws be written on? If math is in the domain of the mind, are we really saying that the universe came out of a mind, that mind predates the universe, as he said? So even the attempt to circumvent the idea that there was a definite beginning have led to other approaches to explaining the origin of the universe that also have theistic implications. And I get into that in quite a bit of detail in the book.
Well, this is just all so rich. I mean, because what you're saying is that they come up with this idea that, it had to be mind. And then you think, mind? What is mind? Mind is this immaterial thing that it goes beyond science. We're not talking about a brain. We're not talking about a computer. We're talking about a mind. What is a mind? So everywhere they turn, it seems, lately, they bump up against this God hypothesis, which is why You've written the book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. When we come back, folks, more with Stephen Meyer and the return of the God Hypothesis. Folks, I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. Stephen, I want to go through these three things. First, we talk about the Big Bang. Then we talk about fine-tuning. Then we talk about the extreme complexity of DNA and how these things you say in your book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, lead us inevitably and more to the idea that there's a God. Whereas 50 years ago, we didn't know some of these things. But I want to go back to 1985, when you were a young man in Dallas at this conference. Tell us what you experienced in seeing Alan Sandage on stage, because this is the moment when you began this journey and began thinking about it looks like science may be leading these top scientists to think about God. Take us back. I mean, you write about this in the book, but
I tell this story. It's been part of my story, but I attended a conference. I was a 27-year-old geophysicist, and I attended a conference that came to Dallas that was debating the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness from a materialistic or atheistic perspective and a theistic perspective. And they had top scientists and philosophers all around the world that had been convened at this conference.
Who were some of the folks that were there? Because this is like a who's who. I mean, it was kind of
amazing. One of the astrophysicists was Donald Goldsmith, who was Carl Sagan's science advisor. Another was Owen Gingerich from Harvard University, Alan Sandage from Caltech. That was just on the cosmology panel. On the origin of life panel, you had people like Dean Kenyon, who was a leading origin of life researcher, Clifford Matthews, same. And then in the philosophical discussion of the origin of and nature of consciousness, you had people like Alvin Plantinga, and there were people across the ideological spectra as far as atheists and theists, and they were in a sense divided to debate these big issues. And I was struck as a young scientist at how the theists actually seem to have the intellectual initiative in these discussions. It very much surprised me, having come out of an undergraduate background where you would have thought that the Christians would be eaten by the lions. It seemed to be just the opposite in this kind of conversation. And on the first panel, Sandage surprised everyone because he was a long time and well-known agnostic Jewish astronomer. And he took the panel, rose to the podium and sat with the theists, and then proceeded to explain for the first time that he had experienced a religious conversion, not in spite of, but because of the evidence from his own field. And he gave an extraordinary talk on the scientific evidence for the Big Bang Theory and the discovery that the universe had a beginning. He talked a bit about the fine-tuning. And then in talking about the discovery that the universe had a beginning, he said, and I had the footage of this afterwards, he was looking into the camera and he said, this is evidence that can only be described as a supernatural event. There's no way that within the confines of physics that this could have been explained or predicted. And so this was rather shaking, rather startling. And to me, it made a big impression. And then in the origin of life panel that followed, there were several scientists on the panel who were arguing for this new idea of intelligent design, though they called it, they said that we were seeing evidence of an intelligent cause in this digital information that was stored in DNA. And all of the panelists on the origin of life, in the origin of life discussion, acknowledged that origin of life research had come to an impasse. We weren't able to explain the origin of the first life from simpler non-living chemicals. Nobody really had a clue about that. And one of the big problems— I find that funny though,
because this is 1985, right? And here we are a zillion years later, and the more
no progress has been made on this.
I mean, but it's even more than no progress. It's like the more we know, the more we know that we don't know anything. Like
the harder the problem is.
That it doesn't work than we were even in 1985.
Yeah, and you've had Jim Tour on your program, and Tour has been, reading these guys chapter and verse on the difficulties of moving from simple non-living chemicals to a functioning cell that contains digital code. And this was the problem in '85. People recognized it. It was very difficult to conceive how you could get from chemistry to a genuine code. And the panelists, Dean Kenyon, Charles Thaxton, Walter Bradley, on the theistic side, we're arguing that digital information in our experience is the product of intelligence. And so maybe it's time to open science to the possibility that we can detect the activity of intelligence and certain types of effects. I went on and did my PhD on origin of life biology to explore precisely that question.
Well, we've leapt to the third thing. Of course, we're talking about origin of life stuff and information theory, I guess. But so we started with the Big Bang, and you're saying again that, I mean, I'm fascinated with the way information travels. You know, in other words, somebody can discover something, but it's decades before it works its way into the popular consciousness or even into the wider scientific conversation. So the Big Bang is a huge number one. Number two is intelligent design, and then the third, related, is the idea of the complexity of a cell. Let's just look at that. Let's start there, because that's what you wrote your a book, A Signature in the Cell, about. What do scientists say? And we're going to run out of time here, but I just want to know, what do scientists say who are not on the same page we are theologically? Do they still believe that these things just happen in the primordial soup? Do they?
Mainly they're asking for more time. It's premature to infer a designing intelligence from the presence of the digital information in DNA, because we just haven't figured out how undirected material processes could have done it yet. But as I argue in Signature in the Cell and in this book, we have a wealth of experience. In fact, our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, shows us that information always comes from a mind, not from an undirected process.
We're going to be right back to continue all of this, talking to Stephen Meyer. The book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Folks, I'm talking to Stephen Meyer, the new book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, it seems like scientists who don't want to believe in the idea that God created the first life, the first cells, they really have a strong bias. In other words, it seems to me like the evidence, even if we're not sure, would lead us to think that it was not possible in any other way. But they have a bias to natural processes. They say that it's got to be that. Anything but that is unscientific, even if the scientific evidence leads to that.
Yeah, there's a default rule of reasoning in the scientific community. It has a fancy name. It's called methodological naturalism. But the interesting thing is it's only been around since the late 19th century. And the idea of methodological naturalism is that you must explain all events and phenomena by reference to strictly natural or materialistic causes, and not consider creative intelligence. Now, in most domains of science, that's perfectly sensible, because we're asking questions about how one part of matter affects another part of matter, and therefore we want to give a materialistic explanation. But when we're talking about the origin of the universe, or the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life or new forms of life, or the nature of human consciousness, we may be dealing with we may be dealing with a type of question that should leave us open to the idea that a mind played a role. After all, life might have arisen by undirected material processes, but a mind might have played a role, and we might be able to tell from the types of features that we find in living systems that mind did play a role. And this is the actual empirical argument I make in the book, is that we do have those types of features that are in our uniform and repeated experience, universally indicative of the prior activity of a mind. What am I talking about? Again, the digital code, the information that's stored in the DNA, and also the complex information storage, transmission, and processing system that's at work in living cells. That just is mind-boggling to people who are working in the areas of high-tech digital computing. They recognize, I had a Microsoft programmer who worked with us for a while who said, I get a feeling somebody figured all this out before us, because I see all these computer design patterns, these known ways of storing and processing information that we've recently developed in digital computing present inside the cell. Indicators, obviously, of a master programmer, he thought, and I do too.
Well, it is wild stuff, because obviously what we're doing is we're talking about the boundaries of science, right? We're getting to those edges. The Big Bang, you know, to go 13.8 billion years ago to the moment when the universe comes into being. Science takes us to that point, but then it sort of acts as though, well, even to talk about what happened before that or how it happened or whatever, it's unscientific. We still have to be stuck in this naturalistic model, even though we're talking about the boundaries of the natural world, the boundaries of nature.
That's a great point, Eric. And we're also talking about a different kind of science, a forensic or historical science, where we're trying to infer what happened in the past from the clues that are left behind. And it's in that type of science where I think it's perfectly legitimate to consider the possibility that creative intelligence or mind may have played a role in the origin of something. If, for example, I walk into the British Museum and look at the Rosetta Stone, and all those wonderful inscriptions that the archaeologists were able to decode, and insisted that, well, that it can't have been a scribe, it must have been wind or erosion or some materialistic process, I'm going to miss something obvious, because information we know in our experience is an indicator of intelligence. So when those archaeologists found it on the Rosetta Stone, they knew that a scribe had played a role. It wasn't just wind and erosion or chemical etching. So if we're wanting to discern what caused something to happen in the past, we've got to be open to the possibility, at least, that a mind played a role. And in these three big discoveries that I've been discussing in the book, in each case we have good reasons to consider that intelligence or mind is the best explanation.
You talked about Alan Sandage. Because of your book, I have looked into his life, and it's really extraordinary. I mean, here's a man, he's the protege of Edwin Hubble, and he takes over Hubble's job. Tell folks about that and a little bit about his story, because it's so fascinating that this one figure, probably the leading astronomer of the 20th century, that he's the guy who makes this theological journey, and that you were there really to witness it in 1985.
And the journey is really interesting, both scientifically and theologically. Scientifically, yes, he's a PhD student of one of the colleagues of Hubble, and then a graduate assistant to Hubble, and then he takes over the research of examining the light coming from the distant galaxies, and he's able to verify that in nearly every quadrant of the night sky, the galaxies are giving evidence of this expansion. And that implies, if you back up the picture, I've got a little balloon here I could blow up. Blow the balloon up, the galaxies expand, but then if you back up the time clock, back extrapolate at every point in the past, they're going to be closer and closer and closer together, eventually getting back to the point where they all congeal in one point, marking the beginning of the expansion and arguably the beginning of the universe. Now, Sandage was acutely aware of this, because he was the guy that did the astronomical observations to verify that those initial observations of Hubble were representative of the whole of the night sky. And so he, at a point in the early 80s, he began to really reflect on this. And in his talk in 1985, he explained that he realized that this pointed to the need for a cause beyond the universe, that there could be no material explanation for the origin of matter itself. And the second thing he realized was that this bothered him a great deal, that he didn't want to think about what this most likely meant. He saw this had fairly obvious theistic implications, suggested the need for a creator that would transcend the universe, but he didn't want to consider that. And that's, he said, where he really began to do business with himself, because he realized he prided himself on his scientific objectivity. His own scientific research was leading him in the direction of a conclusion that he didn't want to consider, and he had to ask himself why. What was it about himself that made him reluctant to even consider that? And he said at that point he started to do some soul searching, and eventually had a religious conversion.
Well, I find it fascinating because there are so many scientists who don't do that. They really cling to the paradigm, just as the Vatican clung to the paradigm when Galileo was saying, no, please look through the telescope and you'll see that some things are different. And they didn't really want to know. They wanted to cling to the paradigm. You see this over and over with people who have power, but it's fascinating that here you have a guy like Alan Sandage. For some reason, he was willing to look past his preconceptions or his biases. We just got 15 seconds left. Any reason why you think he was that kind of a person?
I can't speculate in Sandage's case. I just would say that it's almost a universal human tendency to cling to what we think we know, even in the face of new evidence pointing us in a different direction. So it's super important that we keep our minds open to what the evidence says. Follow the evidence where it leads. We're
going to drag you into hour 2 because there is so much here. We still haven't covered it. Folks, the book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Really exciting. Stick around. Folks, this is hour two. I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Meyer, whose brand new book is called The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, this is big news. You are saying that the preponderance of evidence has led us to a place where we have to scientifically talk about God. In other words, we might have ignored it. We have ignored it. Lots of people have ignored it, but it's become impossible. And you say there are three reasons: the Big Bang, evidence of intelligent design, and the complexity of a single cell. We didn't know these things in the way that we do now. Do you think people will take this book seriously who wouldn't have taken this idea seriously? Do you have any indications that folks out there who are not on the same page as you are would be open to this thesis?
Well, we've sent the book out for pre-review and possible endorsement to a wide variety of scientists. We've gotten some very nice endorsements, including one from a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, emeritus professor of physics at Cambridge University. So I think the argument's getting some traction. These three evidences: the universe had a beginning, the fine-tuning of the universe from the beginning, and then the big bursts of digital information into our biosphere over time have, I think, in each case, put the materialist on the defensive in trying to explain these things. And so I think we will get some traction with this argument.
Well, folks like Francis Collins and others with the BioLogos Foundation, they have a different view on a number of these things. Obviously not the Big Bang, but with regard to the fine-tuning and with regard to the DNA, this explosion of evidence, I guess. Where are they?
Well, actually, they mainly disagree with me and the proponents of intelligent design in biology about biology. They still want to hold to some sort of evolutionary model. Interestingly, mainstream evolutionary biologists are now rejecting neo-Darwinism because the mutation selection mechanism, in their own view, in the view of leading evolutionary biologists, lacks creative power. I attended a conference in London convened by the Royal Society in 2016 that was designed to explore new theories of evolution, to formulate new theories of evolution because of the recognized inadequacy of the standard neo-Darwinian view. Our friends at BioLogos want to hold on to a mainstream evolutionary model of some kind and merge that with theism, but they do accept that the fine-tuning is evidence of design at the very beginning of the universe. And that turns out to be a very important piece of evidence in my argument, because after I wrote Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, a number of people asked me the question, well, who do you think the designer is, and what can science tell us about it? Is it a being within the cosmos, and a space alien, an immanent intelligence of some kind, or is it a transcendent intelligence? And I think the fine-tuning evidence shows that the intelligent agent responsible for life could not have been an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, because no being within the cosmos could be responsible for the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics at the very beginning of the universe that make its own life later possible. So
actually, now some things are so dumb, you don't need to be a scientist to see how dumb they are. I mean, to me, that's like a joke. That's like when people talk about, panspermia, we got to talk about
that's the fancy name for the idea, right?
Okay, yeah. So let's break this down because now we're talking about the origin of life. So you and I know that about 4 billion years ago, life appeared in the form of single cells on planet Earth. Now, how simple were those cells? The simplest cell imaginable is what? I mean, what are we postulating?
Geneticists have done what are called minimal complexity experiments, knocking out genes to see how low they can go, how simple can they make the genome. And they still end up with the need for on the order of 200 to 400 proteins in the corresponding genes. That's an immense amount of genetic information. So the very simplest living cell is far beyond the reach of what ordinary undirected chemical reactions can produce. They don't tend to, yeah. So this is a big problem. And because of that, many scientists have acknowledged that maybe the conditions weren't right here on planet Earth to produce life. So they've suggested that maybe life arose somewhere else, evolved on some other planet,
but
some higher intelligence, then seeded life.
It's sort of like saying, it's sort of like saying, hey, where did you get that watch? It's obvious someone designed that watch. It didn't just emerge in the desert. When you found it, it shows evidence of design, and you don't know who designed it. You don't know what happened. And you say, well, somebody gave it to me. Somebody put it there. Well, you still want to know, okay, let's get that somebody and find out how that person designed the watch.
Right. Any being within the cosmos that evolved by undirected material processes would still have to have an initial origin. There would still need to be information arising somehow to get that evolutionary process going. That's the very question that scientists have been able to solve on planet Earth. Pushing it out into space doesn't solve it either.
It's just an unbelievable cop-out. I still can't believe that people like Francis Crick and Fred Hoyle, that they would
Dawkins himself floated this idea at the end of a film where he was interviewed by Ben Stein, saying that, yeah, there might be a signature of intelligence, but if so, it would have had to have evolved by natural processes someplace
Richard
else.
Dawkins, the atheist. Yeah.
Yes, right. But again, there's an even deeper problem with this if you're thinking about panspermia as an ultimate explanation for these three big facts that I'm discussing in the book. And that is that there's no way that an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, the product of some kind of evolution over time, could explain the origin of the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, the initial conditions of the universe that make such evolution possible.
It's so preposterous that I find it funny, even talking about it. Like saying, yeah, there's someone within the universe who's so smart that they figured out a way to make the Big Bang happen and to create the laws of physics so that every atom in the universe is governed by forces that somebody put it. I mean, if that's not God, why are we even having the conversation? It's just insane. But let's just go back to this idea of what our friend James Tour says. He says that, okay, so life begins. We now know that the idea that it just happened by natural processes is too much to believe. We know so much about the most simple life that the idea that it just kind of floated together somehow, it doesn't seem possible. We've had 70 years to look at this. So what do people who still believe that things came together randomly in the primordial soup, how do they think this is possible? Because most of us right now, myself included, we don't know how life was built. So we talk first of all about proteins, amino acids. Tell us the steps, if you could, about what is necessary for the simplest cell to emerge.
Well, one of my PhD supervisors said that the question of the nature of life and the origin of life are inextricably linked. In order to explain the origin of life, we need to know what it is we're trying to explain the origin of. And in the 1930s, when Alexander Oparin, the Russian scientist, formulated the first detailed model of chemical evolutionary theory, we didn't know about the structure of DNA. We didn't know that it contained digital information. We didn't know that the information in the DNA directed the construction of proteins. We didn't know that there was a complex, almost factory-like system for putting together those proteins from the digital code. We didn't know about the complexity of the cell membrane. And every new layer of discovery has, in a sense, raised the bar as to what needs to be explained. In the very first ideas about the origin of life were formulated right after Darwin. And at the time, they thought the cell, Thomas Huxley said the cell was a simple homogeneous globule of plasm. So in order to explain the origin of life, we have to explain what we now find life, how we now find life in all its complexity.
When we come back, I want to break this down with you. This is fascinating, folks. The book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen Meyer, don't go away. Folks, I'm talking to Stephen Meyer, the author of The Return of the God Hypothesis, a whopper of a book. It's going to really turn some heads. Stephen, we're talking about three things. We have the Big Bang, we have fine-tuning, and then we have origin of life and the complexity of the simplest life. So tell us, what do we know now that we didn't know in 1952 with the Miller-Urey experiment? What do we know now about what the simplest life is composed of? and how processes would need to, happen one after the other, after the other, after the other, all randomly, all naturally. We know it couldn't have happened, but what do people say who believe that this happened randomly? How did it happen according to them?
Well, let's first talk about what we know and then talk about some of the most current explanations as they're being formulated. 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule. In 57, Crick posits something called the sequence hypothesis, in which he proposes that the chemical subunits that run along the spine, along the interior of the molecule, are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or we would say today like the digital characters, the zeros and ones in a section of software. Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. By the mid-60s, Crick's hypothesis had been confirmed, and what was then elucidated was a whole complex information storage and processing system where the scientists were able, the molecular biologists were able to determine that the code in the DNA, or the information in the DNA, was directing the construction of proteins, the hugely important molecules that perform all the important jobs in the cell, the enzymes, the parts of molecular machines, and so forth. Subsequent to that, we've been able to make huge advances in the fields of genomics and bioinformatics. The Human Genome Project is one example of that, where we've actually been able to sequence all those millions and billions of digital characters and figure out what they're doing. We now know also that the DNA is controlled by other information in the cell. So there's a hierarchical information processing system that reminds us is reminiscent of the kind of operating systems that we have in digital computing that control other informational modules that are expressed at different times, in the right times, the right place. So it's not just that there's digital code, it's that there's a whole complex, hierarchically organized information processing system in even the simplest living cells.
All right, so this is insanely complex, but you're telling me that there are people who still believe that this insane complexity somehow came about randomly. I mean, is that...
Well, randomly or materialistically, but again, that's an axiom that because many scientists believe it's their obligation to explain everything by reference to completely materialistic processes. But our argument is not just that that's implausible, but rather that these things that we're finding are based on our uniform and repeated experience in indicators of the activity of a designing intelligence. We know of only one cause for the origin of information, whether we find it in a software program or in an alphabetic text or embedded in a radio signal or a hieroglyphic inscription. Information in our experience always comes from a mind. So when we find information at the foundation of life, it is a rational and fully justified scientific inference to conclude that an intelligence played a role. One of the great information scientists of the 20th century, Henry Quasler, said that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity.
It's just staggering to me that there are people who somehow believe that a cell, which we now know to be just preposterously complex, could have emerged through natural processes. But you're telling me that somehow they believe it happened.
Well, just to get a sense of how desperate people are for a materialistic explanation for the origin of life, there have actually been some scientists who have proposed that the ultimate explanation for the origin of life is the multiverse. That yes, the origin of life is so improbable on planet Earth. It's incredibly improbable on planet Earth. The correct configuration of the physical parameters that we refer to as the fine-tuning is also incredibly improbable. But if we conceive of billions and billions and billions of other universes out there, we can explain all of that, because eventually the right universe with the right physical parameters, the perfectly finely tuned for the possibility of life and the right conditions on some planet would have had to arise, and we just happen to be the lucky ones. So the multiverse hypothesis, which is in the thinking of many physicists improbable or implausible as an explanation for the fine-tuning, is now also being invoked as an explanation for the origin of life in some quarters.
Okay, and the reason, it seems to me, is that they ran out of time, so they simply said, well, we'll just take the time we have here and multiply it times infinity with the various universes we need.
Right.
It's so desperate and kind of pathetic. I'm just fascinated that there are people clinging to this kind of thing?
Well, beyond, characterizing it as desperate, there's also a very powerful counter argument to the multiverse hypothesis. A lot of physicists will acknowledge that the multiverse hypothesis is essentially metaphysical because you're positing something that is completely unobservable and beyond even the possibility of observation. But they say the God hypothesis is also unobservable. And that's right, because very often times that's the way science, especially historical science, works. You posit something you can't see to explain what you can see. So why should we favor one over the other? Well, here's the reason you should to favor the God hypothesis over the multiverse. Turns out that if you have all these other universes, that they're then by definition causally disconnected from our own universe. That's what it means to be a universe, a causally enclosed system. So if the other universes don't affect our universe, then they don't affect any events within our universe, including the origin of life and including the whatever it is that set up the fine-tuning parameters just right.
Well, so I was just going to say that if you're talking about different universes, you can't get from those universes to this universe or from this universe to those universes.
Right. So that's a big problem.
Only one universe.
Yeah, right. And so to make this whole idea of a cosmic lottery work, what the multiverse advocates propose is that there's a common cause for all the universes. There must be some kind of universe generating mechanism that produces universes with different combinations of fine-tuning parameters such that our universe just happened to be the lucky one in a great cosmic lottery. But here's the rub. Even in theory, those universe-generating mechanisms that have been proposed, some based on something called string theory, others based on something called inflationary cosmology, those other universe-generating mechanisms themselves require prior fine-tuning, prior unexplained fine-tuning. So the fine-tuning of our universe hasn't been explained by positing a multiverse. It's just been pushed back one generation. It's been left unexplained. And yet there is one thing we know of that explains fine-tuning, whether we see the fine-tuning of a beautiful French recipe and cuisine or a fine-tuning of an internal combustion engine. What we mean by fine-tuning is an ensemble of improbable parameters that work together to perform a discernible function or outcome. And when we see systems that are finely tuned like that, invariably they too are the product of intelligent agency. So we do have an ultimate explanation for fine-tuning. It's intelligence. The multiverse does not circumvent it. It just pushes the need for such an explanation back one generation.
It's comedic. Let's go to something simple. For example, do you believe it is possible that whales and other marine mammals evolved from Earth-based mammals?
Well, it's possible, but I think the evidence for that is far less compelling than people think. We have a project we're supporting right now in mathematical biology, where we have paleontologists teaming up with mathematicians who work in a field called population genetics to calculate what are called the waiting times. How long would it take to generate a particular morphological feature in organisms? And they've actually been looking at the whale sequence. It turns out that the distinctive characteristics of aquatic mammals arise in a very brief window of time. And if you do the math using the Darwinian framework of population genetics, which allows you to calculate how much evolutionary time change you should expect in a given amount of time, if you know certain factors like the generation times and the population sizes and the mutation rates, it turns out that there's not nearly enough time by Darwinian mechanisms to generate these distinctive characteristics of the aquatic mammals. And so this is one of many what are called waiting times problems, where the Darwinian math shows that the Darwinian mechanism is implausible because it lacks the amount of time that would be required by reference to Darwinian theory to generate the complexity of the attributes of these organisms that arise in the fossil record very abruptly.
Well, it is extraordinary to think that we have so many questions, but your book, again, titled The Return of the God Hypothesis, it's hard to believe at this point, knowing what we know, that any of this could have happened without God. I think that's the most basic takeaway, is that the more you look at it, you say, well, whatever the details are, the idea that there's no God seems wildly preposterous. It didn't.
And the way I'm,
oh, forgive me, Stephen. We're going to a break. We're going to be right back, and Stephen is going to start and end that sentence. Don't go away.
No problem.
Folks, I'm talking to Stephen Meyer, the return of the God hypothesis. Stephen, you were just about to say something and we had to cut you off.
Well, I just was going to explain the way in which I unfold this argument, because in the first two books that I wrote, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, I argued that from the informational properties of living systems, you could infer that an intelligent agent of some kind had played a role. To use the Bill Gates observation again, DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. That seems to imply the need for a master programmer for life. But that raised the question as to the identity of the designing intelligence. In this new book, I take that on. Many people ask me, who do you think the designing intelligence was? And what can science tell us about the identity of that agent? Well, by widening our area of inquiry to include not just biology, but physics and cosmology, I think we can get a very solid answer to that question. And that's because we have evidence of design from the very beginning of the universe that no being that arises after the universe could be responsible for, and because the universe itself had a definite beginning, suggesting the need for a transcendent cause, a cause beyond matter, space, time, and energy. So when we look at the evidence for the beginning, the fine-tuning from the beginning, and then the evidence that arises long after the beginning, I think we can infer theism as the best explanation and exclude other possible metaphysical systems of belief. For example, deism might explain the evidence of design we have at the beginning, but not evidence that arises long after. A space alien designer might explain the evidence that arises after the beginning of the universe, although I think that's implausible for the reasons we discussed. But it certainly can't explain the origin of the universe itself or the fine-tuning from the beginning of the universe.
Let's go back just so folks are tracking. When we talk about fine-tuning, in some ways we're talking about two different things, right? We can look at the Earth and say that this planet appears to be fine-tuned for life, and we can go on and on and on, and it's astounding. But what you're talking about, when we talk about the Big Bang, we're talking about the universe itself. In other words, the idea that 13.8 billion years ago, when the Big Bang banged, everything was already set perfectly so that planets could form and stars could form and galaxies could form. Most people don't normally talk about that. So let's talk about that. Let's forget about the Earth. Let's just go all the way back. You say, and others say, and I say, that the very universe in which we live was fine-tuned and had to be fine-tuned from before the beginning. It didn't have time to write itself, or it didn't have any way of writing itself if it wasn't getting it right in the beginning. It had to be fine-tuned from before the beginning so that when exploded into existence, we get the universe we have. So tell us about that so people are tracking.
Right. And sometimes physicists talk about our living in a Goldilocks universe. There are multiple physical parameters, as well as the initial arrangement of matter and energy at the beginning, that had to be exactly right within very fine tolerances to allow for the possibility of life. I talked in one of the earlier segments about the evidence for the expanding universe. It turns out that the force that drives that expansion, called the cosmological constant, is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 90th power as an accepted estimate of the physicists. Now, to put that number in perspective, there are only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the entire visible universe. So to get the fine-tuning right by chance would be equivalent to blindfolding someone, setting them loose in the universe and telling them, go find that one elementary particle. But also, you can't just look in our universe, you've got to be looking in 10 billion other universes our size. It's an exquisite degree of fine-tuning for just that one parameter. And there are many others: the strength of gravitational attraction, the strength of electromagnetic attraction, the strength of the other fundamental forces in physics, the masses of the elementary particles, such as the quarks. All of these different parameters have very precise ranges in which life will be permissible. And not just life, even basic chemistry is to get even basic chemistry going. Many of these parameters have to be very finely tuned. And so this is an extraordinary discovery. It started with, oddly, Fred Hoyle made some of the first and most important discoveries. He was a profound atheist at the time, later shifted his worldview, became very much more open to theism. It was quoted as saying that a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible.
Okay, so just so we understand, Fred Hoyle was an atheist. He believed in the steady state universe. He made fun of the Big Bang idea. He thought that was stupid. He called it the Big Bang
as a pejorative. Yeah.
Right. We've been calling it the Big Bang ever since. But you're saying that as time went on, he became more and more persuaded that there was no way things could just be the way they are. But he's famous, of course, for in the 60s coming up with the carbon. Tell us about the carbon beryllium.
Oh, right. It's a fascinating story because he is intrigued, fascinated, perplexed by the abundance of carbon in the universe. He thinks very long and hard about it. People have talked about maybe life being based on some other type of chemical element like silicon, and he realized it just wasn't plausible. Carbon uniquely had the ability to form these long chain-like molecules, which allow it to form molecules capable of carrying information, for example. And so he thought we need to have an explanation for the abundance of carbon. He was doing work in stellar nucleosynthesis, how molecules or the basic elements form within stars. And he realized that carbon, to explain the abundance of carbon, there was a whole cascade of necessary conditions that had to be just right. One of which was the precise strength of the gravitational force in relation to the precise strength of electromagnetic attraction.
Okay, hang on. We're gonna. This is just. I think your great learning has made you mad. We're gonna be right back talking to Stephen Meyer. The book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Don't go away, folks. I'm talking to Stephen Meyer. The book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, you're talking about Fred Hoyle, who recognized that in order for the carbon in the universe, which is necessary for life, to have been created in the interiors of stars, something needed to be perfectly fine-tuned. And he said, well, we know the carbon is here, therefore it had to be perfectly fine-tuned, and he turned out to be right.
It was a big puzzle how you could get the smaller elements to combine to make carbon. And he finally came up with a way that he thought it could happen by combining beryllium with helium. But that implied a version of carbon with an energy level that was higher than the normal carbon we see.
And what is an energy level for those?
Well, it was called a resonance. It's the amount of energy associated with the molecule and the amount of energy necessary to get the two elements to combine to make a third. And so he got in touch with a Caltech physicist named Willie Fowler and said, look, see if there's a carbon that has a resonance level at 7.65 mega electron volts above normal. And Fowler initially laughed at him and said, why should I be looking for that? That's too bizarre. But Hoyle persuaded him to do it. He found it and then realized that not only did the energy level need to be finely tuned, but to get a carbon molecule to form with that exact resonance in the interior of stars, there were a whole host of other parameters that had to be just right. And this is what led him to conclude that we lived in a Goldilocks universe. This was the beginning of the discovery of many similar fine-tuning parameters. And that ended up shifting Hoyle's worldview rather dramatically. I had a chance to talk with him when I was a grad student. He came to do a talk and I stayed after to ask him some questions. He ended up inviting me to walk with him. We talked for about a half an hour and I told him what I was working on with the idea that the DNA molecule was providing evidence of intelligent design because of the code. And when he heard me say that, he said, oh, walk with me. He said, there's no question that if we could talk about intelligence, that a lot of these things would be a lot easier to explain. So Hoyle had a very profound shift in his thinking about what science is telling us, whether it's pointing to a materialistic worldview or a theistic one. And I would say he was sort of proto-theistic by the end of his career.
I mean, you get that impression from the quotes, because I've read a number of quotes and I think, wow, this guy definitely came around to thinking that things had to be fine-tuned. And I know that atheistic scientists were troubled by him. They started attacking him, who was this arch atheist at the beginning of his career, sneered at the Big Bang, believed in the steady state hypothesis. And at the end of his life, he shifted to the point that he was being attacked.
Well, and this is a trajectory that I've personally seen many times. We saw it with Alan Sandage, Dean Kenyon, the leading origin of life researcher, who at that 1985 conference announced that he had had an intellectual conversion to intelligent design from a strict materialistic account of the origin of life. He later had a religious conversion. We think of a member of our larger team of scientists now, Gunter Beckley, the great German paleontologist, who first rejected Darwinism, then embraced design, and then came around to a theistic worldview. Anthony Flew, the great British philosopher, who was a longtime atheist, who, upon encountering many of these arguments for design, had the same intellectual transformation. This is becoming a fairly common occurrence, and I think that's because the scientific evidence is actually very powerful, especially if you stop and think about what it means by reference for the big worldview questions.
What's funny, though, Stephen, is that most people in the world are very unfamiliar with what we're talking about. Anybody who watched the Cosmos TV series with Carl Sagan, in 1980, or watched the recent one with Neil deGrasse Tyson, they all are being told the opposite of what we're talking about here. So most people are living in a world that's all of these ideas are foreign to them.
Well, and you asked at the beginning of the interview, why are we just now talking about the return of the God hypothesis when some of these discoveries have been around for 100 years or so? And part of the reason, I think, is that we're learning more and more about each of them, but also the attempts to explain the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, or the origin of life in materialistic terms have failed. The attempts have been exhausted. There have been multiple tries, but there's a point of exhaustion arising within the materialistic scientific community. And I think there are more and more scientists and philosophers doubting the adequacy of materialism as a framework. I tell the story in the book of an interaction I have with one of my friendly debating partners on the other side. This debating partner always starts by telling about his deconversion experience from Christianity and embracing a sort of scientific atheism. But when we were alone in the car afterwards, driving to the airport, I asked him, well, what was really responsible for this? And he said, well, it was just the success of science. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, like the discovery of DNA and the discovery of the Big Bang. And I said, but you admitted on the podium that you have no explanation for the origin of the information in DNA. And you certainly can't explain the origin of the universe itself. He says, yeah, that's right. And what about the fine tuning? He said, well, there's the multiverse. And I said, but do you really believe that? And he just said, nah. So some of this is a bit of posturing, I think. And I think honest materialists are encountering not just these three big questions, but other big questions like the reliability of the human mind, a huge problem in epistemology, the origin of consciousness, the problem of objective morality. All of these things are problems from a materialistic point of view, explaining how morality works, why the mind is reliable, and where the universe and life came from. I think materialism is a failed philosophy.
I think we've just got about a minute and a half left in this long interview. And Albin and James will correct me if I'm wrong. But Stephen, it's just, those of us who've been following your career, we're just so proud of you for putting it out there, because there are many people searching and they simply don't know where to look, whom to listen to. Your book's not easy to read. I mean, the parts about information theory at the end are, it seems, more for those who are in that world. But the basic case you make, I don't know how people get past it. I mean, I really think we are at a point where the return of the God hypothesis is happening. I really have to believe that people are secretly making changes in the way they view things and being open to the idea of God.
Well, and in the book, I tell a bit of my own story of searching for answers as well, especially in the final chapter. And I've tried to tell this as a story. So there's a story woven into the scientific case, and I think you're right. I think the main evidences are things that anyone can understand, and if you reflect upon them, I think they do lead to the question that God is a reality.
It's amazing. Folks, the book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Big book, important book. Stephen Meyer, congratulations, and to be continued.
Always, Eric. Really fun to talk.
Quick question. Do you share the values of the people who sell you things?
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell.
I can tell you that I do. I love Mike Lindell, not just Mike Lindell, but what he stands for.
And I encourage you to use this time at home to get back in the Word, read our Bibles, and spend time with our families.
The dude said that at the White House. How can you not love him?
What difference at this point does it make?
No, actually, it does make a difference. How you spend your money is as important as how you vote. And you don't want to, help elect some crazy guy, do you?
You may cut me, man, but I'm going to wrap this chain around your head.
Did he just say that?
If you fell off sideways, you landed on the darn cement.
So if you want your money to support good things, visit mypillow.com.
Corn Pop was a bad dude.
And please use the discount code ERIC or Metaxas.
If you used pomade in your hair, you had to wear a bathing cap.
A bathing cap? Anyway, please go to mypillow.com and use the code ERIC or Metaxas.
Corn Pop was a bad dude.